Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I thought it'd be good to do a reflection here on some of the, sort of the political issues surrounding our fascinating world we find ourselves living in. And one of the things that I think is underappreciated is the nature of our government and, sort of the question of democracy, as it were. And so I thought we'd do a lecture on democracy, meritocracy, and aristocracy. And theoretically, we all love and believe in democracy, and we think it's the best possible form of government. In practice, we've really done, generally speaking, very little reflection on what we mean by democracy, how it functions, and what the likely outcome of that is. And so first, right, the classic definition of democracy is rule by the people. Demos just means the people, or the citizens, if you will. And so, one of the big historical references has been, well, who counts as a citizen? For a long time, it turns out women didn't count as citizens, for instance. They couldn't vote, so they couldn't participate in the democracy, basically. And so that's one of your big debates about democracy is who gets to participate. And then there's the structure of democracy, and there's all, so many different flavors of democracy. But one of the big core features that I think is very little reflected on and has come up in recent weeks because of the whole, craziness of the pandemic in the U.S. is the notion of what do we elect people to do? So if I vote for a governor or a president or a mayor or something, what am I electing them for? In theory, what I'm shooting for is I want someone who's going to represent my will, right? They represent me in government. That's representational government. And so the governor or the mayor or the president or whoever I vote for, assuming my person wins, is supposed to do what I want, right? They're supposed to reflect my ideals, my goals, my values. So that is one theory of democracy. Another concept, though, is to say, I want someone to do what's right, right? Of course, what right is very variable, hence, all the disagreements in politics about what is the right thing to do. But these are different concepts. One is to do the will of the electorate, the will of the people who got you there. Another one is to do what you conceive of as right, which hopefully reflects somewhat on the will of the electorate, but these are quite different. And you see this, the governors of Texas, Florida, and Arizona have come in for a lot of criticism because they sort of rapidly reopened their states, and this has led to a huge spike in cases. And so people said, they're terrible, right? These are terrible. These are doing a terrible job. And it's like, well, one way to think about this is to say, well, is their job to do what the people want? Because it seems like the people thought they wanted the state to reopen. They may be rethinking this, of course, but it seems like they thought they wanted the state to reopen. Or are they supposed to do what they think is best? So this is an actual, what if people vote for you to do crazy shit, even though they don't really know what the outcome would be, or if they change their minds, right? So this is one of the problems with the notion of the will of the people. So theoretically, we think, great, democracy, you elect officials, they do the will of the people. Functionally, what we tend to think is, great, we have democracy, we elect people, they should do good things, right? Of course, always hard to define what we mean by good things, but whatever seems good to us at the moment, I believe, would be the thing. And so everyone always accuses politicians of changing with the wind, and they have no morals, and they go, and it's like, well, if your electorate keeps shifting around underneath you, which I think historically is a pretty good guesstimate of what's going on if you're a politician, then by God, you're supposed to in a democracy, aren't you? So this was the big critique of Socrates, or more accurately, Plato or Aristotle, many of the ancient thinkers. The big critique of democracy was the right thing is not subject to a popular referendum. Having people decide what's right does not make something right. Just because everybody or 51% of the people think something is correct doesn't make it correct. And so having decisions made by popular elections has no correlation necessarily with doing the quote unquote right thing. And this is a classic example of a critique of democracy that's been around since as long as democracy has existed, whatever, we're running on, 2,500 years or so. The problem with this critique, though, and not that there is no problem with that critique. Actually, it's perfectly accurate. There's no reason to suspect that just putting things to popular votes, like, okay, what's the rough weight of Mars? If we put it to a popular vote, this is not necessarily going to produce anything that correlates it at all with the mass of Mars. So that's sort of that's a problem, right? And many trickier questions, of course, like morals and all these ethical issues are even more contingent and difficult to pin down. So it is true that there's no reason to think that giving people the vote will produce on average the right answer. Well, again, how you define right, we'll talk about this. So the problem, though, here this raises is like, okay, let's say what we really want is to elect people who know good things and will do the right thing. Of course, what's good and right, open to question. Well, this basically is what we would call, in some ways, a meritocracy, or even a technocratic meritocracy. So if you want to elect people who have special knowledge, this is the idea of basically a technocracy or a meritocracy. It depends how you want to think about it. I'll distinguish these in a second. But a techne just means sort of knowledge or capacity having to do with sort of specific physical actions. It's, sort of not the arts. This was the techne, and again, comes from Greek. And so a technocracy is someone who knows how to do specific things. So when we're in a financial crisis, for instance, the financial meltdown of about 12 years ago, what you're looking at is, so a lot of countries, particularly in EU, you saw this, wanted to elect and did elect very specific, like economists gained a lot of power, and these people who theoretically had technocratic insight into the problems were like, oh, the electorate wanted something good to happen. They don't know what the good was, so we'll elect people, or we'll give power to people, or we'll believe people who have, particular technical insight. The problem with this is that it didn't show any evidence of producing good results, right? That's it's sort of like, it's not clear that these technocratic leaders did anything besides exacerbate many of the problems. And the history of the technocratic elite is very weak at best. So, the Great Depression was caused in some ways by a technocratic, the central bankers who were pretty much in charge of the major world currencies loved the gold standard. It was one of these, it was like a fetish. It was like an idol. One might even say a golden calf, as it were. And they were willing to sacrifice incredible amounts of pain of their people to the notion that, we have to stay on the gold standard. Now, it wasn't crazy, right? There were reasons to believe this. It just turned out that it was not functional in a post-World War I world. And it was one of the major factors contributing to both the advent of the Great Depression, but certainly it was what made the Great Depression great. That by the time they decided to abandon that idea, which was the sort of core belief of the technocratic elite of the world banking system, it was just too late. They had sort of dug such a large hole that all that much that follows was followed from that. So the record of the technocratic elite is very weak. Another example would be The Best and the Brightest, a book by, I believe, David Halberstam, who talks about the brilliant technical, intellectual capacity of the people who got the United States mired in in the Vietnam War. I mean, so just brilliant insight, technical capacity, all kinds of, everything you could want in people. And what did they do? They led us right into a horrible war that just, killed lots of people, huge cost of Vietnam. We always talk about the U.S., but Vietnam paid a much, much higher price for this war in human lives and lost capacity and destruction than the U.S. did. But it's still horrible for everybody, right? No winners in that war. And so you go, wow, if this is what technocracy gets you, maybe we should be a bit suspicious. But when you have a problem, say a pandemic, don't you want to listen to those who know? And again, I mentioned this before, the problem is scientific knowledge does not equal the answers to real ethical problems. And if I'm elected by a populace who says they want me to open as soon as I can, there's a governor, then it's not crazy for me to do that, even if my, medical professionals are saying, hey, there's a risk here. Well, my population may want to take that risk. That doesn't make me crazy. It may make me wrong in the sense of the medical outcome is going to be negative, as we found out, pretty negative, but it doesn't make me crazy as far as trying to respond to the democratic impulse. It's a very strong democratic impulse. It's not somehow this is being portrayed as, these people are just crazy lunatics out there, but part of their crazy lunatics is if the population is crazy lunatics, then hey, there you go. Then you're representing the will of the people. And so trying to figure out how that works, it's basically one of the core, if not the single core problem of democracy. And when you live in a country, as we do, that thinks of itself as a meritocracy, which I would say is a relatively pernicious idea. The notion that, we reward merit, therefore those who have the rewards are meretricious. Meretricious? That's not the right word. They have earned it. That it's sort of this tautology where you go, we're a meritocracy, therefore people who have money or power or whatever, fame, must merit it because we're a meritocracy, as opposed to saying, why do they have it? Should they have it? Is it, how do they acquire it? We don't ask that. We just sort of have this tautological assumption as a cultural baseline. You saw this again in the recent run-up to the presidential election that's coming up, where Michael Bloomberg, former Republican billionaire, announced that he was running for office, and basically the only thing he apparently had going for him was that he was a billionaire. I mean, this was it. I mean, he was like, why are you running for office? Well, I'm a billionaire. And it turns out that gets you a remarkable amount of traction because we think that they have a special knowledge, right? They know the right thing, probably related to economics, because they're a billionaire. Therefore, good economic things will happen if someone with special knowledge of what's right is put in positions of authority. And you see this, all the time. They always say, who's going to regulate, who's going to oversee the banking industry? Well, you got to get bankers because they know what's going on. They understand the industry. You need that sort of insight and knowledge. On one hand, that's not crazy. On the other hand, regulating a banking industry is mostly about ethics and almost nothing about banking. Right? That's, when, these decisions, you go, if you do this, this will hurt, corporations or banks. And you go, okay, that's it's a political question. That's not a banking question. But bankers, of course, don't want that. Or you say, if you do this, this will help a lot of poor people, but it might be very expensive for other people. And you go, okay, that's an ethical question, not a banking question. And so the question is, you need technical insight, but when does technical insight become an end to itself rather than something that helps to inform larger ethical decisions, which is really what politics is mostly about in theory. In practice, maybe not so much, but in theory, this is what we want. We want our elected officials to be making ethical decisions that we hopefully agree with, rather than make simply further specific technocratic goals. So this is, we struggle with this because, of course, we want our elected officials to do the quote unquote right thing. But is the right thing what we want them to do? Or is the right thing what actually retroactively turns out to have been good historically? These are totally different. And who decides, again, what's right? And of course, the electorate is continually changing. And so, what happens is elected officials, not wanting to bear the burden of these sorts of decisions, tend to cede power, again, as in the financial collapse, to people who have the technical knowledge. And this, again, if you look at the history of the financial collapse, if you look at the history of the Great Depression, if you look at the history of the Vietnam War, a lot of the decisions that were made under the guidance of, or actually were in the purview, the people had the power of this very highly trained specialists and technical people who were doing it for the right technical reasons. It just turned out to have this unbelievably horrible outcome. And so, again, we should be suspicious of that. But because we desire to have officials who know and who do the right thing, then what happens is you cede power to specialists, because we want the specialists to be able to, if nothing else, give us cover, right? If I'm an elected official, I can say, well, that didn't work, but I was using the best advice of, this economist that engineer, those medical professionals, these space experts, right? Whatever, military advisors, whatever it is, right? I took the best advice available, and so, even though that didn't work out, hey, what can you do? And in some cases that's true. Just because you do everything right doesn't mean you're necessarily going to succeed. But often it turns out that power is being ceded to these officials, some of them elected, some of them unelected, based on specific knowledge rather than any sort of democratic principle. And that's, again, the core problem, one of the core problems with democracy. And then this leads on to the question of, okay, so if specialist knowledge or specialist capacity gives you power in a meritocracy, so this is how a technocracy, is related to the meritocracy, is when in our society, what gives you merit is either money or specialist insight. And the government is basically specialist insight. Outside the government, it's basically money. And so, and of course, these are not unrelated. So you have specialist insight, you're in the government, and so you go, okay, we'll give you special authority and power and access based on your technical capacity, your insights, which seems good and reasonable. And then this gets promulgated and reproduced so that outside of government, money itself becomes a measure of merit. And so you are meritorious if you have money, and therefore what you do becomes increasingly important depending on how much money you have. Again, in the recent run-up to the election, Charles Schultz, I believe, of Starbucks announced that he was going to run as an independent candidate. And it turned out that he was, roughly speaking, the worst candidate in recent memory. I mean, he really, really had no concept of politics, but he made the rounds, apparently got on all the shows, he was interviewed, he was taken seriously, and he was taken seriously despite his single achievement that would make him eligible was simply that he got really rich with Starbucks, which, okay, that's interesting business, but does it give you any political capacity? It turns out it doesn't, and he was a horrible candidate and quickly had to withdraw this idea. And yet there it is, right? Why was he even given the opportunity to be taken seriously? Well, because he had this merit, this apparently key insight into how money and finance and economics works. And so this ramifies or rolls over into this notion of, right, we want the best people to rule, not the people who represent the will of the people, but the people who are the best. Vote for the best people, and then they'll do the right thing. You don't need to consult the people. And this is the notion, of course, of an aristocracy, right? So aristo simply means the best, right? Rule by the best. So an aristocracy is the idea of, who are the best people? You want the best people to be in charge. Now that, again, that's just totally reasonable, right? But it's also completely vacuous because you have to decide, what do you mean by the best, right? How do you define what constitutes the best? Being a billionaire, being someone who has all this merit because they become a billionaire, does that make them the best? Therefore, they should be in charge? This is what Schultz and Bloomberg thought. They thought, well, we're rich, so we should be in charge. What other qualification do you need? Apparently none. Apparently that's plenty. Or do you need something else? Do you need some other special skill? Maybe we should be ruled by a technocratic elite. So rule by people who have PhDs in economics, or rule by Elon Musk, right? Like, let's put him in charge because he seems to get a lot of stuff done. He seems to take care of business. He seems slightly nuts. That seems good. Let's put Musk in charge and see what happens, right? So that, quickly rolls over into say, okay, let's define what we mean by best and then put those people in charge. The slight problem with that is that how the hell do you determine who's best? And then, how do you measure whatever it is, whatever metric you've decided to use there? But the tendency historically, very, very strong tendency for the best, once you arrive, is to define their descendants as the best, right? They almost inevitably become hereditary. And instantly, this does not take a lot of time. So currently, if you look at the Ivy League schools, Harvard, Stanford, Yale, etc., Rice, I think, is in there in that list. There's a study, and they showed that, roughly speaking, there is more students in Ivy League colleges from the 1%. So this is 1%. So it's households earning more than, I think, $600,000 a year, something like that, than there are from the bottom 50%. right? So this is an extraordinary number. That 1% is producing more students at the top schools, theoretically the top schools, than the bottom 50%. So 1% would be, so that's about, in the United States, going to be what, 3.6 million people. The bottom 50% is going to be 180 million, give or take, right? So that 3.6 million people should produce more students at Ivy League schools than 180 million, suggests that perhaps this isn't entirely meritocratic. That how this is being measured starts to look slightly suspicious. But this is the history of aristocracy, right? Once you define the best as, the people with the money, then you go, of course, the best schools want to have the best people, and the best people just happen to be the children of the people who have all the money. What a coincidence. By the way, this is also a convenient way to build very large endowments for your college. Then this structure becomes self-perpetuating, right? Who do we want in our school? We want the best. How do you define best? Well, it turns out that we use all of these markers and we use all of these different capacities to identify the best based on very specific outcomes that have nothing to do with the merit of the individual, but a lot to do with the fact that they were raised in incredibly wealthy environments. Which brings us right back around to democracy, of course. So if you don't want to have the rule of the best, the aristocracy, who quickly will ensconce themselves, then you have to kind of figure out, okay, what's another good rubric for picking them? And any number of different systems have been tried. And the one that we currently have is to sort of vote for people. And we vote for a lot of people in the United States, by the way. I should make a little historical note. The United States has, by most historical standards, an unbelievable number of elections. I mean, wow, do we have a lot? Because we have elections for local officials and school boards and special districts, and we have referendums, and we have initiatives, and we have statewide elections, and we have national elections, and we have national presidential elections. So we vote a lot. I forget what the average is, but I think it's like there's an average like 2.7 elections a year in the United States. There's just this unending wave of different levels of participation. So we don't have one democracy. We have not one kind of democracy, because we have, elected representatives federally. We have elected representatives locally. We have school board representatives in local districts. We have initiatives in many states, so that's just like a popular referendum. So there's this huge variety of different forms of democratic participation, which is, of course, one reason the United States is very variegated, and you get all these, sometimes seemingly outlandish results, is because, our system is sort of really complex, but there's a lot of voting. In many countries, you vote every once in a while for one party or the other, and then they kind of run things for a year or 2 years or 3 years, and then you go back to the polls and you go, okay, maybe there's a first round and a second round in some countries, but usually you don't have this like continuing. Some countries do have this, by the way, but generally speaking, a lot less than us. So our democracy is multifarious, many different versions of it that go on simultaneously, and the states, of course, are all different as well. So it's a rich tapestry of democratic approaches going on all at the same time. But it still doesn't answer the question, unfortunately, of are we voting for people who represent what we want and what we think is best, or are we voting for people who will do what they think is best, and we're willing to cede our notion of what's best to their judgment? And then when the politicians get in office, are they sitting there going, I need to do what I think my constituency wants, even if I think maybe it's not a good idea? Or should I use my own insight and maybe the advice of my technical experts to override what my constituency wants and make them suffer from things that they don't want, because I think this is the right thing in a grander picture? Whew. See, those are some insoluble problems right there. They're both democracy, but we tend to say that we dislike both or like both depending on the outcome. If a politician does something that we dislike, that we voted for, we tend to say, well, that's not what I voted for. They're not representing my will. Go, okay, so you only want to have elected officials do what you perceive to be the general will of the populace, or at least that percentage of the populace that actually voted for the politician. But then if a politician does something that seems to reach out to their constituency and do what they want, then we say, oh, they're pandering to the masses. They're just giving people whatever they want. It's like, well, sure, right? Why wouldn't, you're a politician. Isn't that your job to pander to the masses? And they go, well, no, what if it's really bad for some grander vision, if it bankrupts the state or causes some environmental damage or causes, medical crisis? Well, if you're democratically elected, right, which do we want? It turns out the answer to that is yes, we want both. We want them to do the right thing when it's right, and we want them to do what we want when what we want is what we think is right, but don't ask us to get any clearer than that. And so I think it's worth reflecting on the sort of tensions, again, that we feel in the democratic system when we face some sort of these kinds of crazy unknowns. And we go, oh, what we want is our elected officials to do what's right. But that is not a clear guidance. Who decides what's right, and who decides when it's right, and is it better to be right or to do the will of the people in a democracy? Which is the greater responsibility? Whoa, those are tough problems. They're really at the core of the problems of democracy. And this has, by the way, been the critique of democracy since democracy was invented. Conversely, or another aspect of this, of course, is when you look at aristocracy, however selected, be it money, be it technical insight, be it sort of heredity, what do they do, right? How do they make decisions? They say, oh, we're above it. We're just going to do whatever we think is best. And it turns out that, curiously, they almost always think whatever is best is whatever is best for them, right? It's this, they sort of have a worldview, and they tend to really subscribe to that. And then because it's a worldview that allowed them to gain positions and maintain positions of power and authority and maybe wealth, and so they tend to think that those are right? Not crazy. But if I think it's, who said it? Somebody said that it's very difficult to convince a man that something is wrong as if his job depends on that thing being right. Which is fair enough. You're like, yeah, if I need to believe it to keep my job, then I'm going to probably believe it. If it's going to cost me my wealth and my estates and my power, then I'm probably not going to disbelieve it. I'm going to think, no, that's probably for the best. And so how you choose an aristocracy, how you decide what is the best, simply transfers that question to a different place and creates the same problem in other places. And so when you read something like Plato's Republic, it's a very long, incredibly insightful, but also strained at places attempt to address this, right? How do you get the people who really do want the best and know the best into positions of power? And what's clear is that it's sort of this non-functioning nightmare state. You compared it to various kinds of oppressive Orwellian never lands, right? You're like, oh my God, this is like a dystopia of the first order. But, of course, Plato didn't think it was a dystopia. He was trying to solve this problem. And he knew perfectly clearly that just giving the aristocracy, the people who currently had the money and the power, that giving their kids control, that he's like, well, that's not a very good system. That doesn't take a lot of reflection to work that out. But he's looked at democracy and he's like, look, how can you take a bunch of people who individually don't know what is good, average their votes, and say that's the right idea? He said that's just insane. And so we can't do that. And so his solution is, heavily influenced by Sparta there. But that notion of trying to find who knows, and then if you could just put who really knows in charge, then you'd be in business. Always be leery of this concept, is one of the things I'm driving at, because the history of putting the people who know in charge ends up looking just like the kind of dystopic nightmare that Plato described, not thinking it was a dystopic nightmare, because it's, these are not scientifically soluble, clear issues. They're the unbelievably vexed swamps of ethical compromises within the incredible complexity of the range of human experience and desires and outcomes and changeability. And it's like, ooh, damn, right? It would be great if we just knew what was good and we can get the people in office who would do the good things. But the problem is we don't know what's good. We don't agree on what's good. And we don't know how to achieve the good, even when we sort of agree on what the good would be. It's really much trickier than it seems like it ought to be. But the history of human civilization shows that this is really quite a vexing problem. So as we approach, we're an election year, of course, here in the United States. As we approach a big election coming up, is worth, meditating on this notion of like, wow, what is it that we actually expect from our democracy, right? And why would we expect a democracy to be anything but sort of a crazy mixed bag when the people who make up the democracy are a crazy mixed bag? And in some ways, I guess, embrace that, make that like part of the feature rather than thinking, oh, if only we had something that worked more smoothly and made more sense. Because I think that smoothness and sensibility tend to come at the cost of, humanity. And I'm always leery of that. So thank you very much, and I hope this finds you well.